So Bob Neill, Conservative MP since 2006. You've got a big job. You're chair of the Justice Select Committee, and I'd like to spend a lot of time in this interview talking about your views on the criminal justice system, prison, crime. But I just want to start by asking you, there's a couple of things that I noticed you've been campaigning on recently. Stroke care and saving the English National Opera. Tell me about why they're important to you.
Well, they're very personal things, Gloria, because my wife is a professional singer, but sadly 3 years ago she had a stroke. And out of our family's experience, it struck me that we're great with the NHS about the life-saving bits of the system, but we're nothing like so good about the follow-up and the stroke care. And we found Anne Louise's voice was affected and some other problems, which unfortunately impacted on her career. But we struggled to get through the system, to get the therapy and the support that she needed. And people we met in hospital were in a much harder position, much less well placed to navigate the system than we were. So we'd just like to try and make that better, and it's a cross-party campaign that we've got. We set up an all-party parliamentary group for stroke. Surprisingly, there wasn't one until a couple of years ago. And I've done it with Margaret Wheeler, who's a Labour peer, whose husband has also been through that problem. So we're trying to raise the whole issue about both mechanical thrombectomy, which can greatly reduce the amount of disability that stroke survivors have if you can get it done in time, and also the need for a much better workforce to deal with physiotherapists, speech and language therapists, where we've got a real shortage, and those things. So that's a campaign that I think is important, that I want to try and bring our experience to. Try and make something positive out of what was a bad experience for us as a family. And then English National Opera, well, partly that connection. My big interest outside politics has always been music and the theatre and opera. ENO does a brilliant job. It's the most accessible of our companies, and I think the Arts Council completely lost the plot in cutting their funding. It actually means that people, both in London and elsewhere, will get less good opera. And I was a lad from a semi-detached house in Hornchurch, didn't have any background in serious sort of high art, but I was hooked on opera when I got to see it. On ITV years ago, an excerpt from Tosca. And then I used to get up in the gods as a student, and I want more people to be able to do that. And obviously with Anne Louise's background, that's something I'm passionate about. And again, we've been working on a cross-party basis, people like Harriet Harmer, Margaret Hodge on the Labour side, and I hope we're getting it up the agenda, and I hope we'll be able to persuade the Arts Council to say, look, we got this one wrong, and we need to row back from the amount of cuts that are actually threatening the whole existence of the company.
Do you have to care for Louise and your wife Louise in any way since the stroke?
Well, we're fortunately able to afford care and help, but she does need care. And again, that's a real strain for many people. We're better placed financially and otherwise than others, but it shouldn't have to depend upon that lottery of either what your income is or where you live, the postcode sort of lottery that you can get for care as well. So that's why I think it's important that we keep this up the agenda.
Okay, so let's talk about the big job that you have, chair of the Justice Select Committee, holding the government to account. It's cross-party with the government majority, of course. We have just got a new Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk. What should his number one priority be?
Well, I mean, Alex is a very good appointment, if I might say, because he's got a serious experience in the justice system. He was a barrister for a number of years before he became an MP and specialised in criminal work. So I think the priorities Alex has got to tackle immediately are the nuts and bolts of the system. And that's first of all delays in the courts. We've got a serious crisis with delays in the courts. That's a question of backlogs that existed even before the pandemic, but were made worse. We have too many courtrooms which are out of operation because of poor maintenance. I think he needs to increase the budget there. It's unacceptable that people are waiting for trials to be heard some 2 years or sometimes more after the event. It's unfair on the witnesses, potential victims. It's also unfair on defendants as well, and it makes for worse outcomes. That's got to be a top priority. That also means making sure that we're paying the barristers and solicitors who act in the justice system properly. And we know we had disputes in the past where barristers were refusing to take cases. Alex has got to rebuild bridges with the legal profession and the judiciary, because we can't work without them. Second big priority is overcrowding in our prisons. We're creaking at the seams already. If we're recruiting 20,000 more police officers, that's going to put more pressure on the system.
Does prison work? Does it cut crime?
It doesn't effectively all the time. And the second thing that Alex has to tackle is the state of our prisons. They're overcrowded, and many, particularly the older Victorian ones, are in a poor condition. We've also got real problems with retaining experienced prison officers. If you don't have a good workforce, it's harder to keep order in prisons, and it's also harder to turn around those prisoners who are going to come out, and you want them to come out in a better state than when they came in. And very often are issues with drug addiction, mental health, very poor education. Many have been in care in the past. It's a vicious circle that they've fallen into. Now, if we're going to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system, we've got to find better means of dealing with those people. At the moment, we incarcerate a higher percentage of of the prison population than any other country in Western Europe, one of the highest incarceration rates.
You think that's too high? Do we send too many people to prison in your view?
I think we do, and that doesn't mean that there aren't some. Here you have to. Prisons for the dangerous people, prisons for the people who are a threat, not necessarily the best place for people who we're annoyed with and who are a nuisance and maybe low-level repeat offenders. We've got to find better means of dealing with them, perhaps with tagging involved, as well as much more robust community sentences, and also tackling all those issues as to what, earlier on before they get into the system beforehand. Because we, as well as having the highest rates of imprisonment, we also have some of the highest rates of reoffending. So it's clearly not joining up together.
When people look at the justice system, one of the areas they often highlight is rape conviction rates. Cases up, reported cases up, conviction rates are shameful, really. Is there any fix that you could recommend to get that figure up? Sure, it's not easy, but do you have any ideas?
Well, we looked at it as a select committee on more than one occasion, and it is difficult. I practiced at the criminal bar, as you know, Gloria, for 25 years before I came into Parliament. I used to both prosecute and defend in rape and serious sexual offences, as well as many others. I think the thing to bear in mind is you've got to have sufficient evidence, first of all, to bring the charges. And I think a lot of the problems are at the evidence gathering stage. The statistics show, interestingly, that when you get the case in front of a jury, the conviction rates for rape and serious sexual offences are about the same as other offences of violence against the person, GBHs and so on. But what we fail on is actually getting it in front of the jury to start with. And that's because either the evidence isn't gathered sufficiently or isn't in good enough order for the Crown Prosecution Service to justify the charges. It has to meet the standard test that there's a realistic prospect of conviction. And maybe that's because in the investigation process, we still don't treat complainants well enough. We don't always give them enough support. And because of the delays that we were talking about, very often, if it's going to be months and years before the case comes to trial, the person who's been through that dreadful experience drops out of the process. They don't want to go on with it anymore because it's a permanent reminder over their lives and they want to move on. So getting those cases done quickly is really important, I think, to improving the conviction rates. But of course, you only want people convicted where there's good evidence to prove it. But you've got to help the witnesses to do their best to give that evidence, and those delays and other problems get in the way of that.
And the reason why we have this new Justice Secretary, and you've given him lots of advice, is because Dominic Raab has resigned following the inquiry, the independent inquiry into whether or not he bullied some civil servants. Does Alex Chalk need to give him a bit of love? I think
I was a minister at a much more lowly level for a time, and I really valued the civil servants. And I think having a good professional relationship with your civil servants is absolutely essential. So, there's no harm in giving a bit of a hug to people, but that doesn't mean you can't be demanding as well. I can think of ministers who have been very demanding, but you can do it in a way, I think, where you know that even if you're saying, that really, I think we need to do this differently, that's not enough, I need more than that. But you can do that in a way, I think, which encourages them to do better. And that's what I think we've got to do. I think Alex, as a character and a personality, will do that very well.
The big issue in politics at the moment, and perhaps it's never been far from being near the top of the political agenda in recent years, is illegal immigration and how to combat it. Suella Braverman, she talks really tough. She wants to act really tough on combating illegal immigration. Who doesn't want to stop illegal immigration? Is she doing the right things to stop illegal immigration? Will her policies, plans, what she wants to do, will it work? Will it do the job?
You see, I'm afraid, Gloria, I'm not convinced that they will, because a lot of the emphasis has been on changing the law, on legislative solutions. And I don't think that's where the issue lies, actually. The real problem is that the system doesn't work efficiently enough. We're not getting a system where people who come in potentially unlawfully are got through the immigration tribunal and asylum system quickly, where decisions are made quickly, and they are then, when they don't have a right to be here, removed quickly. And frankly, it's the administrative failures of the Home Office that are to blame. And that's happened under successive Home Secretaries, going back over years. But frankly, the Home Office is not efficient. And we need, rather than worrying about changing legal tests, none of that will matter if you haven't got, firstly, enough people to do the investigations. So they will put more resource into that. Secondly, you need to get the quality of the investigations up and running so that you can have the hearings quickly. I've got a friend who sits as a part-time immigration tribunal judge, actually in the southeast of England, so where the pressures really are. He was only asked to sit 5 times last year. There wasn't enough work. And why was that? Because the Home Office didn't have the cases ready to bring before the tribunal. I suggest the most important thing is to get that sort of thing right, so you can get a decision, yea or nay, quickly, and then you have to have a sensible arrangement with France and our neighbours for returns. We've got to have a proper returns policy, and when we left the EU and the Dublin Convention, we didn't do anything to fill in the gap. So those are the things that I think will make a difference. That actually requires a more emollient approach to our working with our European partners rather than a blame game. It also requires actually putting some money into the system rather than juggling around legal tests, which might make headlines, but aren't actually going to get the numbers processed through and people who shouldn't be here out of the country more quickly. Final
question. Listening to you, some people will think, and you can refute the characterisation if you are, that you're quite liberal. You're a liberal Conservative. If you accept that, whether you accept it or not, who is your political hero?
I'm happy to accept it because I'm quite proud of being somebody who believes in free markets and a free economy and traditional institutions. So I'm very traditional Conservative in that way. But I do think also the Conservative Party needs to reflect the society in which we now live. And that's what we've always tried to do. And that's, I suppose, if I had a political hero, it would probably be Harold Macmillan. When I started getting interested in politics and history at school, Macmillan was, of course, still alive. I only met him once. And he was a classic example of that one nation Conservative, which I make no bones about being, who was quite tough and a really skillful political operator, but also was a pragmatist and thought the Conservative Party did best in the middle ground. Funny enough, of course, he was also MP for Bromley, which is a part of my constituency. So plenty of reasons, I think, for me to think Harold Macmillan is the person that has influenced my thinking, probably, in practical terms more than anyone.
Sir Bob Neill, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gloria.